The engine room of the USS Essex vibrated with the familiar, low-pitched thunder that never truly stopped, not in daylight, not at night, not in the rare hours when the sea seemed mercifully calm. To the men aboard, that rumble had become the pulse of their world, steady and unrelenting. It was June 1944, and somewhere beyond the steel corridors and the constant scent of oil, the Battle of Saipan was already beginning to unfold in the distance like a slow-burning storm. But in the hangar deck, where the air tasted of fuel and metal, no one yet knew how violently that storm would break. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Jack Winslow tightened the strap of his flight goggles and peered down the length of the hangar. Aircraft Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers filled every inch of space, wings folded like sleeping predators. He could feel the tension clinging to the air, as tangible as humidity before rain. For 2 days the pilots had been waiting, listening to rumor after rumor, watching the Japanese response unfold as scattered reports filtered in from reconnaissance. But now the waiting was ending. A boatswain's whistle shrieked through the deck speakers. Then a voice, calm but edged with urgency, filled the cavernous space. All pilots to stations. Launch sequence priority red. Repeat priority red. Jack swallowed once, sharply. There were orders. And then there were orders. Priority red meant the fleet needed overwhelming force. Fast, violent, decisive. Something had changed out there. Around him, the hangar exploded into motion. Mechanics wheeled tool carts aside, crews scrambled up onto wings to unhook clamps and fold out panels, and the deck trembled as elevators began to rise. The Essex was waking up, the way a sleeping giant might, one eye open before the other. Jack grabbed his parachute pack, slinging it over his shoulder as he jogged toward his Hellcat. His crew chief, Petty Officer Roy Maddox, was already there waiting, a wrench still in his hand and grease streaked across his cheek. Maddox wasn't much older than Jack, 25, maybe 26, but something about him had always felt older. Maybe it was the cigarette always hanging from the corner of his mouth, or the way he talked like he'd already lived 3 lives and was wary of starting a 4th. "Bad news?" Maddox asked, without looking up. Jack shook his head. "No idea, but something must have spooked command." Maddox snorted. "Damn well better be big if they're planning to run all 90 birds at once." 7 minutes, they said. "I don't even know if that's physically possible." Jack felt his chest tighten. 90 planes. In 7 minutes. It was a number that didn't feel real, not until you imagined 90 engines screaming into life, 90 sets of wings cutting the salty wind, 90 pilots holding their breath as they hurled themselves off a single strip of steel over an ocean trench, so deep it felt like a myth. "Guess we'll find out," Jack said. Above them, the massive elevator shuddered as it locked into place flush with the flight deck. Brilliant sunlight streamed down through the open hatch. The Pacific sky was impossibly clear, an expanse of blue so unbroken it seemed wrong, given what they were about to fly into. Jack climbed the ladder into the cockpit and slid into the seat, the leather warm from the sun. His hands moved automatically. Harness, straps, throttle check, magnetos. He had done this 1,000 times in training, 24 times in real combat, but each time felt like a small prayer disguised as procedure. The deck speakers crackled again. Enemy aircraft intercepted 70 miles east. Major Japanese formations expected within the hour. The strike group will launch in full before they reach carrier range. This is not a drill. Not a drill. Not practice, not a probing attack. A real threat, possibly one of the last large-scale Japanese carrier-based responses in the Marianas. Jack exhaled slowly. Somewhere deep inside, adrenaline flickered like a struck match. Then came the most critical order. Launch every strike aircraft, full deck load. Priority targets Japanese naval assets and forward airfields on Saipan. All pilots, prepare for immediate takeoff. The Essex was going to throw everything it had. On the flight deck, hundreds of men surged into coordinated action. Yellow-shirted plane directors signaled with frantic purpose, white-shirted officers oversaw the sequencing, and ordnance crews rolled carts of bombs and torpedoes into position. Jack watched as the 2 rows of aircraft ahead of him began creeping toward the bow under the guidance of crews waving glowing wands. The launch line was forming. Then he noticed the glances, the way some of the deck crew were pausing to stare at the horizon. He followed their gaze. Dark shapes were rising, thin and almost imperceptible at first, then sharpening into black specks against the sky. "Bombers," Maddox muttered from below, gripping the railing. "Damn, they're coming in faster than expected." If the Japanese reached the Essex before the strike group could get airborne, every plane crowded on deck would become a single catastrophic target. The ship's loudspeakers barked again, almost frantic now. "All crews expedite. Launch sequence compressed to 6 minutes if possible." 6 minutes. 90 planes. Jack heard Maddox curse softly. "Fly fast, Lieutenant," he said. "If this works, you'll owe us all a drink." Jack opened the canopy again for a moment. "If this works, I'll buy the whole damn hangar." Maddox grinned around his cigarette. "That's the spirit." The canopy slid shut with a firm clack. Jack lowered his goggles. The world outside became framed by the curved glass, sharp and enclosed. His cockpit was now both his shield and his cage. Engines began roaring to life across the deck, one after another, the collective sound swelling into a thunderous wall. Propellers spun, blurred into transparent discs. Exhaust fumes rolled across the deck like ghostly fog. Jack's engine kicked, rattled, then smoothed into a steady growl beneath him. The deck vibrated violently as the ship increased speed to generate the wind needed for takeoff. Sailors crouched low, gripping tie-down chains and railings. Jack could feel the ship leaning slightly, carving a path across the ocean, and above it all, the Japanese dots in the sky grew larger. A plane director signaled the first aircraft forward. One Hellcat inched into position at the bow. The deck was almost clear. The wind whipped so hard that Jack's oxygen mask strap fluttered against his helmet. Then, with a stab of glowing wands, the first plane gunned its engine and launched. It shot forward like a hurled spear, vanishing into the sky. Another launched, then another, then another. Jack watched them go, one every few seconds. The Essex performing an act that no Japanese officer would have believed possible, a full deck launch, aircraft packed nose to tail, engines screaming in coordinated fury. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind him, elevators clanged as they brought up the next wave of aircraft. Mechanics sprinted, loading belts of 50 cal ammo, slamming panels shut, ducking under spinning props. Someone yelled for more hydraulic fluid. Someone else cursed as a wrench skittered across the deck. Another launch, and another. The Essex was spitting steel and fire into the sky at an impossible pace. Yet the Japanese bombers were closing fast. Jack tightened his grip on the control stick. Any hit on the deck now, even a glancing one, could wipe out half the strike group before they were airborne. The Japanese knew it too. Carrier doctrine was universal. Hit the flat top before its planes could take off. Jack's flight row edged forward, his heart pounded harder with every few feet. A young signalman sprinted past his wingtip, nearly slipping on fuel slicks. Jack recognized him, Seaman Colt, barely 18, always smiling. Today there was no smile, only raw fear. Yet Colt still carried out his orders, waving to deck crew to clear a path for the next plane. Explosions boomed in the far distance, American destroyers firing warning bursts at the incoming formations. Jack swallowed. Come on, come on. The next plane launched, then the next. His row moved again. The sky above was filling with smoke trails as American fighters from nearby carriers began climbing to intercept. But they were scattered, uncoordinated, caught mid-patrol, without time to form up. On the horizon, the Japanese bombers descended another 100 feet, their engines a faint, ominous thrum. Jack's row reached the final yellow line. Plane directors pointed. Their movements were almost balletic, now precise, practiced, but visibly strained by urgency. 2 more planes launched. Jack's turn was seconds away. Maddox appeared one last time beside the wing, giving him a final thumbs up. Jack pressed gloved fingers to the canopy glass in acknowledgement. Then a siren wailed, shrill, piercing, unmistakably dire. "Incoming! Dive bombers, incoming!" The Japanese had reached attack range. Every pilot in line tensed, but the deck crews didn't stop. They couldn't. Stopping now meant losing everything. A shadow passed overhead. Jack snapped his gaze upward just as the first Japanese bombers came screaming down in steep, murderous angles. Tracer fire erupted from the Essex's anti-air batteries, streaking upward like fiery ropes. Oerlikons hammered, Bofors thumped. 50 cal machine guns chattered from every corner of the deck. Shell casings rained down like metallic hail. A bomb exploded off the port side, sending a geyser of water towering into the air. The shockwave jolted the deck, rattling Jack's canopy. Another plane launched a torpedo bomber this time. Then another. Jack was now third in line. A Japanese dive bomber roared past, so low that Jack could see the pilot's goggles flash in the sun. The enemy dropped a bomb directly toward the center of the deck. Jack's breath caught, but the bomb missed by less than 20 yards, detonating in the water with a blast that sent steam and salt spraying across the bow. The plane directors didn't even flinch. They pointed, waved, screamed against the wind. Jack's row moved again. Second in line, a bomb struck the ocean behind them, rocking the stern violently. Sailors stumbled, caught themselves, kept working. Someone on the far side of the deck fell and didn't get back up. Another American fighter launched. Smoke was thick now, the air tasting of metal and fire. Jack's heart hammered in his throat. The plane ahead of him surged forward as the director pointed sharply. The pilot revved, released brakes, and shot off the deck, his plane dipping dangerously low before lifting into clean air. Now Jack was first in line. The deck ahead of him shimmered in the heat. A Japanese bomber rolled into another dive, heading straight for the Essex. Jack slammed the throttle forward. His Hellcat lurched, straining against the brakes as its engine howled. The director pointed wildly, urgently, desperately. "Go!" Jack released the brakes. The Hellcat lunged, tires skidding slightly before gaining perfect traction. Wind screamed past his canopy. The bow rushed toward him. Another bomb whistled down behind Jack's wheels left the deck. For an instant he felt suspended, weightless, like a single leaf lifted by the wind. The ocean yawned beneath him, deep and blue and endlessly hungry. Then his plane caught air, lifted, steadied. He was flying. A massive explosion rocked the carrier. Behind him, a column of fiery spray leaping skyward. Jack looked back instinctively. The Essex was still there, scarred, smoking, but intact. Planes were still launching. They were actually doing it. 90 aircraft, 7 minutes. Jack exhaled shakily and banked his Hellcat toward Saipan, joining the first forming wave of the strike group. Below, the Pacific stretched wide and glittering, beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Ahead, the distant shape of Saipan loomed green jungles, volcanic cliffs, and smoke rising from the airfields where Japanese defences were already bracing for impact. Behind him, the Essex continued to send aircraft skyward like an unbroken chain of steel and fury. And high above, the sky swarmed with the chaotic dance of fighters, American and Japanese alike, twisting in trails of smoke and gunfire. Jack steadied his grip on the stick. This wasn't just another mission. This was the turning point, one that would shock the Japanese command, who had never imagined that a single American carrier could unleash nearly 100 planes faster than some airfields could scramble a squadron. Jack joined formation beside Lieutenant Harris, who gave him a quick nod. Ahead, their dive bombers and torpedo planes stretched in long, shimmering lines. And somewhere over Saipan, Japanese soldiers would soon be staring upward as an entire sky of American aircraft descended upon them in a tidal wave of engines and flame, a sight no one in their high command had believed possible. Jack pushed the throttle forward. The battle was waiting, and the sky, crowded, roaring, relentless, was already beginning to burn. The formation tightened as the strike group pushed deeper into the vast blue expanse between the Essex and Saipan. The sea below glimmered like hammered steel, broken only by trails of white wake from ships far behind. Jack's Hellcat flew steady in its position within the fighter screen, one row among many, guarding the lumbering bombers nestled in the middle of the formation. The Avengers, packed with torpedoes, flew lower and slower. The Helldivers, burdened with bombs, kept a slightly higher course. Jack and the other Hellcats swept in arcs above and around them, scanning for any sign of Japanese interception. The radio crackled with clipped chatter. "Eyes open. Boys, enemy fighters should be coming from Tinian. Maintain interval. Harris, tighten your altitude. You're drifting." Jack listened with half an ear, eyes scanning the sky. The Pacific horizon was a deceptive place, too clear, too open. It was a canvas where ambushes could materialize from nothing. Then Harris's voice cut through. "Contact! 11 o'clock high!" Jack jerked his gaze upward. 3, then 6, then a dozen glints materialized at the far edge of the sky. Japanese fighters, likely Zeros, slicing down toward them in a sunlit descent. Their white-painted wings flashed sharply in the midday light. The Avengers below tightened their formation like a herd sensing wolves. Jack clicked his microphone. "All fighters, break and intercept. Keep them off the bombers." Then, as the lines broke apart, the sky erupted. The first Zero streaked downward in a perfect dive, its wing guns flashing. Harris rolled sharply, the tracers missing him by inches. Another Zero swept across the right flank, taking a burst of defensive fire from a rear gunner. Jack tightened his grip and pushed his Hellcat into a climb, meeting the attackers head-on. The heavy fighter shuddered with acceleration, its engine roaring louder than the wind. A Zero streaked toward him, a thin, aerodynamic predator. Jack centered the gun sight on its nose. The moment stretched. Then he pulled the trigger. 50 caliber rounds thundered forward, stitching a bright line across the Zero's engine cowling. The plane jerked, smoke trailing, then spiraled down in flames. But there was no time to watch it fall. Another Zero flashed past his left wing, then another dove toward the bombers below. Jack rolled hard, chasing the second one. The sky was now a chaos of swirling metal. Contrails twisted into spirals, explosions burst like sudden fireflowers, and the sun glinted off canopies before disappearing behind smoke. Jack closed in behind the enemy fighter just as it lined up for a shot on an Avenger. He fired again, short, controlled bursts. The Zero's tail shattered. The pilot bailed out, his tiny figure tumbling through the sky like a falling leaf. But the Japanese fighters kept coming. They were reckless, fearless, accelerating straight into withering gunfire, willing to trade their lives for a single good hit on the American bombers. Jack saw one Zero dive toward the center of the formation at a suicidal angle. Its guns flashed. An Avenger's left wing burst into flame. Damn it! The Avenger banked sideways, the pilot trying desperately to control it. The fire spread, fuel lines rupturing, flames licking across the fuselage. The radio crackled with a panicked voice. "I can't, controls won't respond." Jack could only watch helplessly as the burning bomber spiraled downward, the crew desperately trying to bail out. 2 parachutes blossomed. A third didn't. Jack swallowed hard. There was no time to grieve. Another wave of Japanese fighters appeared at the horizon, smaller, more scattered, but still deadly. Jack rejoined Harris as the last of the first wave peeled away. Harris's plane was smoking from the engine, cowling, but still flying. "You hit?" "Just scratched," Harris replied. "Still with you." Below them, the silhouette of Saipan grew larger, steep ridges, lush jungle, and the unmistakable grey shapes of airfields carved into the ground like scars. Smoke drifted skyward from artillery positions. This was the heart of the Japanese defense in the Marianas, their forward wall against American advance. The bombers adjusted course. Jack took a long breath. The strike on Saipan was about to begin. He keyed the radio. "Fighters, form up. The bombers are starting their run." The Hellcats pulled upward, sweeping ahead of the formation. Jack felt the familiar shift in the air as the bombers slowed and began to climb slightly, preparing to dive. Far below, the Japanese gunners on Saipan were scrambling, flak guns rotated. Trucks barreled across dusty roads as crews rushed to man heavy machine guns. Jack could see tiny figures, hundreds of them, moving like ants in formations as they braced for the incoming storm of American steel. Then the first American dive bombers rolled over and plunged, the sky filled with the shriek of falling metal. Jack banked left to intercept a new cluster of Japanese fighters rising from an inland strip. They were late caught scrambling as the American attack arrived in full force. The Helldivers streaked downward in near-vertical dives, bombs releasing with gut-wrenching precision. Explosions blossomed across the airfields, hangars torn apart, runway craters erupting like volcanic breaches, fuel tanks igniting into towering columns of flame. The Avengers dropped torpedoes not at ships, but at inland storage bunkers, massive subterranean structures the Japanese relied on to sustain the defense of the island. The torpedoes struck like battering rams. Jack rolled into another sharp turn, chasing 2 Zeros, climbing to intercept the bombers. He fired at the lead fighter. It detonated in mid-air, the explosion almost startling in its sudden brightness. The second Zero dove toward him, guns blazing. Jack pulled back sharply on the stick, letting the heavier Hellcat climb and stall in a controlled arc. The Zero overshot, surprised. Jack kicked the rudder and brought his guns to bear. One burst. The Zero disintegrated into smoking fragments. He exhaled, forcing himself to push aside the shaking in his hands. Below, the bombing continued relentlessly. Oil fires raged across the airfields. Japanese ammunition depots erupted in chain reactions of thunderous blasts that shook the very air. Trucks burned. Planes on the ground were shredded before their engines could even start. Yet, even amid the chaos, the Japanese defenders fought back with ferocity. AA guns hammered from hidden jungle positions. Tracer fire streaked past bombers, ripping through wings and engines. One Helldiver took a direct hit and tumbled downward in a flaming arc, trailing smoke until it disappeared behind the ridge. Another made it out of the dive only to collide mid-air with a rising Zero, both aircraft spiraling together in a fiery embrace that lit the treetops below. Jack clenched his teeth and pushed his Hellcat into another intercept arc. He fired on a cluster of 3 enemy fighters, hitting one and scattering the others. Smoke from the burning airfields drifted upward, darkening the sky. His radio crackled again. Bombers pulling off target, returning to formation. Jack exhaled, with relief. They had made their run. Now came the harder part, getting everyone home. Fighters, regroup on the bombers, he ordered. One by one, the dive bombers and torpedo planes formed into lines again, though the formation was visibly thinner, now gaps marking the places where aircraft had fallen. Harris's voice came through once more, rough and strained. "Jack, 3 o'clock high, more incoming." Jack looked and felt a chill. A final Japanese counterattack, the last defenders. Nearly 24 fighters rose from the far side of Saipan, some Zeros, some older models, some repaired and patched together from scrap. They were not flying perfect formation. Their maneuvers were sloppy. They were outnumbered, outarmed, outtrained, but they were determined. Jack tightened his harness and pushed throttle wide open. He didn't speak into the radio, there was no need. Every American pilot saw the same thing. The final aerial clash over Saipan ignited in a fury of smoke trails, broken clouds, and twisting metal. Jack fired at a fighter that flashed across his nose. It exploded instantly. He pulled into a turn, chasing another. Harris intercepted a third. The sky became a storm of spirals and bursts, planes diving, climbing, exploding in streaks of flame. A Zero latched onto Harris's tail. Jack dove, firing a burst that tore the Japanese wing apart. The Zero spun downward, trailing flames. Harris steadied. "Thanks, Jack. That one nearly had me. Hold position, we're almost clear." Below, the American bombing run had ignited vast sections of Saipan. Smoke columns rose high, forming a grim silhouette against the bright sky. Artillery pits were shattered, supply depots burned, runways lay cracked and cratered. Finally, the The last of the Japanese fighters broke away or fell from the sky. The air grew quieter. The American formation, battle-worn and battered, turned toward the sea. Jack exhaled slowly. They had survived the attack. Saipan was burning behind them. The Essex lay ahead, somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon. But the cost, he forced himself not to look at the empty spaces in the formation. Not yet. They flew in silence for several long minutes, engines droning softly, the Pacific wind calm again. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving exhaustion in its place. Jack felt his arms tremble. Then Harris's voice broke the quiet. "Jack, look!" He pointed ahead. The Essex appeared in the distance not as a pristine silhouette, but as a wounded giant. Smoke drifted from one side. Her deck bore scars, scorched metal, damaged railing, blackened patches. Jack's chest tightened. But she was still afloat, still launching fighters, still fighting. As the strike group approached, the deck crews lined up, ready to guide them in. Jack could see Maddox below, waving them toward their landing lanes. One by one, planes descended onto the deck. Some limped, some trailed smoke. Some came in too fast, their landing gear buckling, on impact. But they returned. When Jack's wheels touched the deck and his hook caught the arresting wire, he felt a shudder of overwhelming relief. His canopy opened. Fresh sea wind filled the cockpit. Maddox jogged up, grease-stained and grinning despite everything. "Hell of a show, Lieutenant." Jack nodded, voice tight. "We lost a lot." Maddox's smile faded. He said nothing. Jack climbed down from the cockpit and looked across the deck as more aircraft landed, some missing wings, others coughing smoke. Medics ran, crews shouted, fire hoses sprayed. But they had struck Saipan with unprecedented fury. And the Japanese, they had been stunned. Reports were already spreading across what remained of the enemy command. One American carrier had launched 90 aircraft in 7 minutes, something they had once believed impossible, something their own carriers could never have matched. The shockwaves of that realization would ripple through Japanese strategy for months. Jack stood on the deck, sweat mixing with the salty wind, staring back at the horizon where smoke from Saipan still curled upward like a dark hand reaching into the sky. Tomorrow, he knew, they would launch again. But tonight, the sky belonged to them. Night settled over the Pacific like an immense curtain drawn slowly across the sky. The horizon glowed faintly from distant burning fuel dumps on Saipan, still smouldering from the day's assault. A thin haze drifted across the moon, casting silver light across the ocean, broken only by the dark silhouettes of the American fleet. On the flight deck of the Essex, the air still smelled of scorched metal and oil. Jack walked along the scarred steel, boots clanking softly as he passed bent railing, shrapnel-pocked catwalks, and a section where fire had blackened the deck to charcoal. Repair crews moved like ghosts under red lamps, welding plates, refitting cables, cleaning debris. The ship's heartbeat, its low, deep engine rumble vibrated steadily beneath his feet. He'd removed his helmet an hour earlier, but the sensation of it remained, like the ghost of some forgotten pressure. He felt the weight of the day pressing into his bones. Saipan still burned in his mind, the diving Japanese fighters, the screaming flak lines, the shattered runway erupting in fire. As he paused near the edge of the deck, a voice drifted up behind him. Couldn't sleep either. Jack turned. Harris stood there, hands in pockets, expression tired but steady. A line of dried blood streaked across his cheek from some old cut that no one had bothered to clean. Jack shook his head. Not after a day like that. Harris nodded and came to stand beside him, looking out over the dark water. Below, the faint pattern of white hull lights lined the ships. Far off in the distance, the American battle line spread in a protective arc. "You know what command said?" Harris murmured. "No." "They think the Japanese carrier groups might be preparing a counterstrike, something bigger than what we saw today." Jack stiffened. "They really think the Japanese still have that much air power left?" Harris exhaled slowly. "No one knows, but a cornered fighter doesn't stop swinging." Jack looked out at the burning silhouette of Saipan. The idea of another full-scale counterattack knotted something deep inside him. They'd barely held the deck earlier. If the Japanese launched everything they had left. After a long silence, Harris said quietly, "We lost 11 bombers today." Jack closed his eyes. He'd counted the empty spaces in the landing pattern. He'd seen the grieving faces in the ready rooms. "And fighters?" Jack asked. 5, including Bailey. Jack flinched. Bailey had been young, loud, always telling jokes. "Families will be notified by telegram." His voice dropped. "I hate that word. Telegram. Sounds too mechanical for death." Jack's throat tightened. This whole war feels mechanical. Numbers, tonnage, sorties. They forget those numbers bleed. Harris chuckled weakly. "Maybe that's why we drink. If we had any left. Oh, Maddox is hiding a bottle somewhere. I'd bet my stripes on it." Jack managed a thin smile. The two men fell into a long, heavy silence. The moonlight gleamed off the water in slow-moving streaks. Far below, a destroyer's wake left a glimmering white trail that twisted through the dark like a serpent. Finally, Harris patted Jack on the shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be worse." "Worse?" Harris nodded. "Command wants a second strike on Saipan at dawn, and if the Japanese are really preparing something, we're going to be in the middle of it." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. Tomorrow, the sky would burn again. He slept only 3 hours. When the announcement came, gentle compared to the previous day's urgency, it still jolted him like a gunshot. "All pilots to briefing room. Dawn strike preparations underway. This is a mandatory briefing." Jack slipped into his flight suit, closed the zipper with stiff fingers, and jogged down the metal corridor toward the ready room. Dozens of other pilots filed in, some bleary-eyed, some grim, some far too calm. Commander Rourke stood at the front, a map of Saipan and surrounding waters projected behind him. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid, a tension coiled through the room like a drawn wire. "Gentlemen," Rourke began, "yesterday's attack severely disrupted enemy ground positions and air capacity on Saipan, but reconnaissance shows that Japanese forces are regrouping much faster than expected." He tapped the map. Small red markers flashed on several locations. "They've evacuated aircraft from underground shelters. They have at least one additional operational runway, and," he hesitated, "signals intelligence indicates that surviving Japanese carrier groups may be maneuvering east of Tinian, possibly preparing a large-scale strike on our fleet." A low murmur rippled through the room. Jack swallowed hard. Rourke continued, voice low and urgent. "Your orders are simple. We strike the remaining airfields at first light. We destroy every plane, fuel reserve, and facility we can reach. The goal is to eliminate as much enemy air power as possible before they launch a counterstrike." He paused, scanning their faces. "You will face heavier resistance today. Enemy losses yesterday were severe, but desperate men fight hardest." Jack exchanged a look with Harris. Neither spoke. Rourke's expression softened slightly. "I won't pretend this will be easy, but if the enemy's carriers attack us while Saipan's airfields are still operational, our fleet will be overwhelmed. This mission could determine the entire Pacific campaign." "Godspeed, gentlemen. Launch in 90 minutes. The flight deck roared again with morning activity, fewer planes than the day before, but still enough to fill the hangar with the stale smell of fuel and oil. A soft pink glow painted the horizon, promising another blisteringly hot day. Jack tightened his gloves as Maddox inspected the fuselage of his Hellcat. "You're patched up from yesterday," Maddox said. "Not pretty, but she'll fly." Jack nodded. "Thanks." Maddox gave him a lingering look. "You okay, Lieutenant?" "You look like hell." Jack managed a faint smirk. "That's comforting." Maddox tapped the side of the fuselage. "Just bring her back again. We're running out of spare parts." Jack climbed into the cockpit and strapped himself in. The canopy closed. The world outside became muffled, the glass framing everything like a photograph. Engines ignited across the deck, propellers blurred into spinning discs. Then the order crackled over the speakers. "Launch all strike aircraft. Fighters first." The first planes surged forward, leaping off the bow into the rising sun. Jack's row moved next. The entire deck shook with the roar of engines and the vibration of hundreds of men preparing for battle. When his turn came, Jack pushed the throttle forward and felt the surge of power propel him into the sky. The wind tore past him, carrying the faint scent of burning oil from the distant island. He formed up with the fighter screen, Harris on his right wing. "You good?" Harris asked. "As good as anyone flying into that mess." "That's fair." Below them, the bombers lifted off the deck in tight waves, forming the heart of the formation once more. The ocean shimmered beneath them. Saipan awaited. The first signs of enemy resistance arrived 20 minutes from the island. Squadrons of Japanese fighters, far more organized than yesterday, rose from behind the clouds, sunlight glinting off their wings. Their formation was tight, disciplined. Jack stiffened. "They're expecting us." "Looks like it," Harris muttered. The Japanese fighters broke into a perfect attack pattern, a converging pincer maneuver designed to smash directly into the bomber formation. Jack snapped the radio on. "Fighters, intercept! Break them before they hit the Avengers!" The sky exploded. Zeros tore through the clouds like wolves charging prey. Hellcats climbed, rolled, dove metal shrieking, guns roaring. Jack locked onto one enemy fighter as it streaked toward the bombers. He fired a burst that clipped its tail, sending it spinning downward. Another Zero shot past his left wing, missing by inches. Jack banked after it, sweat stinging his eyes as he lined up the shot. One burst, two. The Zero erupted into flames, but the Japanese kept coming. Tracers whipped past Jack's canopy. He rolled sharply, trying to shake the attacker behind him. The Zero matched him, sticking like glue. Jack dove toward the ocean, the world tilting violently. The Zero followed. He pulled up sharply at the last moment, feeling his stomach drop as the plane strained under the G-forces. The Zero overshot too fast. Jack fired point blank. The enemy fighter shattered in a spray of metal and flame. He climbed again, lungs burning. "Avenger 3 is hit," someone shouted over the radio. "Engine failure, losing altitude." Jack looked down. One of the torpedo bombers was trailing black smoke, its right wing shredded. The crew bailed 3 parachutes, opening just as the plane plunged into the waves. Another American voice. "Fighter cover, we need help on our left flank." Jack turned sharply toward the cry for help. A swarm of Zeros had broken through the defenses, diving straight at the bombers. "For God's sake," he muttered, pushing his throttle to the limit. He fired into the swarm, scattering them. One Zero exploded, another veered off with a smoking engine, but one slipped through and fired on a Helldiver, tearing its tail apart. The dive bomber spiraled down, pilots screaming over the radio before the signal cut out. Jack's blood ran cold. There were too many losses. He clamped down on the grief. They still had a mission to finish. The bombers reached Saipan, and the island answered with fury. Flak burst around them in thick, lethal clouds. The sky darkened with smoke as artillery guns on the ridges opened fire. Machine gun nests traced glowing arcs upward. Jack watched helplessly as an Avenger took a direct hit and disintegrated mid-air, a burst of flame, then nothing. 2 Helldivers pitched into their dives despite the chaos. Bombs fell, tearing through hangars, workshops, and fuel tanks. Fireballs rose. Another wave dove. Another line of explosions ripped across the airfields. Japanese defenders swarmed out of bunkers, firing rifles and machine guns at the sky. Vehicles raced across the tarmac. Jack flew above it all, engaging enemy fighters, clearing the path where he could. Sweat dripped down his neck. His oxygen mask felt suffocating. The air shook with violence. Smoke from burning structures twisted into towering columns. Explosions thundered from every part of the island. When the bombers finally pulled off, their formation was ragged, half its original size. "Reform! Fighters! Cover the withdrawal!" Jack yelled. Harris's voice answered a shaky but determined sound. On your wing. Let's get them home. The flight back was long, silent, weighted with the ghosts of missing planes. Jack scanned the formation again and again. Empty spaces yawned between aircraft like open wounds. When the Essex finally appeared at the horizon, Jack felt a wave of relief so powerful it made him lightheaded. Survivors landed one by one. Some had holes in their wings, others leaked fuel. Some pilots climbed out and collapsed from exhaustion. Jack landed last, skidding slightly as his wheels hit the deck. When his hook caught the wire, he let out a trembling breath. Maddox hurried up. "Christ, Lieutenant, you look dead." Jack removed his mask. "Close enough." Maddox didn't smile. Behind them, stretcher teams ran across the deck. Jack looked at the returning planes, then at the ones that were missing. His voice dropped, barely audible. "How many did we lose?" Maddox swallowed hard. "Too many." Jack stared out at the endless ocean. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet was preparing its next move. The greatest carrier battle of the war was coming, and the men aboard the Essex would be in its very centre. Tomorrow, the sky would burn brighter than ever, and the outcome would change the course of history. The sun was lowering behind Saipan when Captain Rains returned to the flight deck, the afterglow brushing the steel with a faint gold. The American flag at the island mast snapped sharply in the Pacific breeze. Though the day's battles were behind them, an unusual hush had descended over the Essex. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't even relief. It was a sort of reverence, an awareness that they had crossed some invisible threshold and would never go back to who they were that morning. Rains walked along the catwalk, overlooking the bow, where maintenance crews worked under lamps fixed to bulkheads. Tiny sparks erupted from acetylene torches, fireflies of industry stitching metal plates back together. Here and there, a bent cowling or a shredded wing flap testified to the day's violence. The carrier had launched 90 aircraft in 7 minutes. Now it tended its wounded machines like a mother tending children after a storm. He paused at the rail. "Evening, sir," a mechanic called, tired but smiling in the glow of the deck lights. "Evening," Rains answered. "How many birds do we have patched?" 32, ready by dawn, sir. The rest? Well, we'll make it happen." Rains nodded. "We always do," he thought. Below, the ocean rolled dark and heavy, but somehow calmer than earlier, like even the sea had accepted that Saipan had changed hands, or would soon. The Japanese had fought brutally for every metre of rock, and they would fight tomorrow too. But the tempo, the air dominance, the sheer industrial momentum behind every American task group, it had all shifted the weight of the war in the Mariana skies. Footsteps approached from behind. It was Morris, still carrying that notebook. "Sir," Morris said carefully, "the boys in CIC are replaying Japanese radio intercepts." He hesitated. "You may want to hear this." Rains followed him below decks through a maze of ladders and bulkheads until they reached the Combat Information Center dim lights, glowing radar screens, and the steady hum of filtered air. A young operator, headphones on, rewound a spool-like tape. "Play the section again," Morris instructed. A crackling Japanese voice filled the room. "Unbelievable number. Cannot defend. Skies full of American planes. Where do they all come from?" Then another, more frantic. "They launch too quickly. Impossible tempo." Not in satisfaction, though victory meant survival for his men, but in recognition of the sheer human weight behind those voices. Somewhere over Saipan, a Japanese gunner, barely older than Morris, had looked up and seen doom arriving in a wheeling storm of American steel. The operator lowered the volume. "Sir," they were terrified. You could hear it. Rains placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "War is terror," he said softly. "Ours, theirs, everyone's." He turned to Morris. "Secure the recordings, send a transcript to intelligence." Back outside the CIC, Morris finally asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Sir, did they really not know? About our launch rate?" Rains took his time before answering. "They knew our carriers were fast," he said, "but knowing and seeing aren't the same thing. Today they understood. But so did we. They reached the ready room, where pilots sat slumped in reclined chairs, boots kicked off, jackets half-zipped. The air smelled faintly of sweat, coffee, and burnt gunpowder, an exhausted fraternity whose members had seen things none would talk about for years. Some scribbled in logbooks, others simply stared at the ceiling, replaying the battle frame by frame. Lieutenant Hayes spotted Rains and stood almost automatically. "Sir, evening." "At ease," Rains said, waving him down. "How's the squadron holding up?" Hayes exhaled. "We lost Caldwell and Marker." Rains felt the blow land in his chest. They all had losses. Every victory carried a bill. "We'll honour them at sunrise," he said. Hayes nodded, eyes heavy. "Sir, when we launched this morning, I thought no. I knew we were doing something impossible. 90 planes, 7 minutes. That runway felt like a miracle." He paused. "But out there over Saipan, I realised something." "What's that, Lieutenant?" "That it wasn't the launches. It wasn't even the planes. It was the people. Us, the crews, the mechanics, the ordnance teams, everyone moving like gears in a watch." Hayes shook his head slowly. "Sir, we didn't just fly faster. We became faster." Rains understood exactly what he meant. He walked back onto the open deck again, where night had fully descended. The horizon glowed orange from distant fires on Saipan, each flicker a reminder of soldiers struggling below. Wind swept across the steel. Somewhere, a plane engine coughed as it cooled. A lone sailor hummed a tune to keep himself awake while refitting a wing. Rains inhaled deeply, smelling oil, salt, and the fading heat baked into the deck over a long day. Tomorrow would come. There would be more sorties, more danger, more sacrifice, but tonight the Essex floated beneath a field of stars like a citadel of light in a darkened sea, an industrial miracle forged by a nation that had decided, collectively, that it would not lose. And as Rains looked toward Saipan, still burning in the distance, he whispered the words he never said aloud except in moments like this. "We're going to win this." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.